Good morning and most welcome to our read-through of Stephen M. Rosen's The Strange Nature of Quantum Perception. And this is Heidegger 1379. I will continue where I ended in 1374. And when I learn how to do it, I will also start to make links in previous videos to the concluding and progressive videos in the same subject. And I am presently at page 260. The last paragraph. The ontological difference is reflected in the difference between the ontological phenomena of the classical world and the ontological phenomena of the quantum world. We have seen that the quantum dimension is the first dimension. The natal space and matrix of every other existing space. Thus, the large-scale Cartesian dimensions are first projected from the submicroscopic depth dimension. The ordinary course of perception follows this movement from the pre-objective domain into the familiar realm of object in space before subject. In moving out of the former, quantum reality is relegated to oblivion, and perception implicitly becomes a process of objectification. As exemplified by the phenomenon of binocular convergence discussed in the next section. It seems then that if we wish to re-enter the quantum domain to observe the photon, we must reverse the long dominant direction in which perception operates. The projection of object in space before subject must be withdrawn in an act that carries perception back to its ontological origin. Observing the photon through proprioception we are entertaining the possibility that the single photon and its associated quantum field can be consciously perceived. I have indicated that this would call for a radical change in the way in which observations are performed. In a recursive move, the observer would need to shift gears and bring his attention backward to the source of the observing process. Through this reversal, observer and observed would become intimately related. They themselves would become superposed. Or we could say, bearing in mind the ontological nature of light, that in order to see the photon, one would need to be the photon. I will now explore further what this new form of observation would entail. The movement of perception away from its quantum ontological source into the ontical Cartesian realm is similar to the from-to action of experience described by the phenomenologist Leader. Ordinarily, in whatever we see, we cannot see our own seeing. Since our seeing is what we see from. By upholding the categorical distinction between what we see and what we see from. by upholding the categorical distinction between what we see and what we see from. The subject-object dichotomy is enforced. Sight is directed to an object seen from an unseen subjective perspective. The movement is normally assumed to be irreversible, making it impossible to view subjectivity as such. Here is a parenthesis. I will also add one myself. The last paragraph is decisive. It is neatly put in one paragraph. My second parenthesis is from Jan Eiskens. People in a state of burnout are directed outwards in their looking, and they do not keep the panoramic view, the non-objective view. This is also connected to the Michelson-Morley experiment. In our bid to observe the ontological photon, are we presently looking to challenge the assumption of perception's irreversibility by transposing the subject-object relation in such a way that we can know the subject per se. it was Husserl who hoped to know the subject and with it even greater objectivity than the object had once been known. Heidegger, for his part, did not merely call for a reversal of the inclination to pass from subject to object. He called for a reversal of the subject-object dichotomy. Thereby enabling us to move back into the living web within which all relations emerge, which is to say, into the quantum sphere of being. The gearing of awareness is all important to the reversal in question. In order to perceive the single photon, it is not enough to change the direction of perception. Its gear must be reversed so that it is no longer simply moving ahead. Where were we to proceed toward the photon in this forward gear, we would be attempting to turn around upon this ontological source. Like turning a car around, so that it now faces the direction from which it was previously facing. In such a reversal, we would indeed be inclined to face the photon. To have it appear before us, over against our consciousness. With perception thus geared, we would still be trying to objectify the photon, but would only succeed in obscuring it. Collapsing the ontological wave, rendering the quantum world ontical. Rather than experiencing it in its actual form. we cannot know the photon by simply turning around upon it any more than turning a car 180 degrees to face the direction from which it had been facing, allows us to capture that from as it was initially experienced. Such a turning merely turns the old from into a new to that is seen from a new perspective. It is clear that the attempt to grasp the from of the photon while maintaining the forward orientation is futile. To make such an effort is to chase one's tail. To turn in a vicious circle. The implication of Heidegger's work is that perception must shift into a different gear. If we are to apprehend the ontological photon qua photon, we must approach it in reverse. Notice that whereas turning a car around to face in the opposite direction turns us away from the original direction in which we faced. If we shift into reverse without turning, we continue to face in the original direction. A similar distinction can be made with respect to the ontological photon. In seeking to come face to face with it as that which integrates subject and object. We hope in vain to turn our backs on the subject-object dichotomy, to negate it. By contrast, the movement backward into the radiant quantum realm does not simply negate the classical formula, but brings to light the non-classical ground from which it issues. the backward movement of awareness required for the perception of the photon may be understood as a form of proprioception. Etymologically, to perceive is to take hold of or take through. From the Latin per, through, and capere, to take. And to conceive is to gather or take in. These activities correspond to the ordinary from to forward gearing of ontological consciousness. The term proprioceptive is from the Latin proprius, meaning one's own. Literary then. Proprioception means taking one's own. Which can be read as a taking of self or self-taking. The term finds its most common usage in physiology, where it signifies an organism's sensitivity to activity in its own muscles, joints, and tendons. But Bohm spoke of the need for proprioceptive thought, which he viewed as a certain kind of meditative act, wherein consciousness becomes aware of its own implicate activity, in which its content originates. About 200 lectures ago, we read a paper on Bohm and proprioception of thinking. Interesting, it turns up here. Years earlier, the social psychiatrist Trigant Barrow spoke similarly of the need for human beings to gain a proprioceptive awareness of the organismic basis of their divisive symbolic activity. What I am proposing is that observing the photon requires that the observer function proprioceptively. For such observation would not merely involve observing what is lit, as happens under the classical paradigm. Instead, it would reverse the gears of perception so as to bring awareness of the ontological lighting process per se. We see proprioceptive observation modeled in the reflexive self-penetration that takes place when integrating the perspectives of the naked cube. To be brought to ontological fruition, of course, the micro-world self-penetration of the Klein bottle would be necessary. Let us consider Trigand Barrow's approach in greater detail, since it may help us better understand what is needed for observing the photon. We have found that in the paradigm of object in space, before subject, the subject plays the role of an idealized cogito, standing apart from the world and acting upon it with impunity. Barrow's term for this Cartesian subject engaged in ceaseless acts of objectification is I persona. For Barrow, the functioning of the I persona has a distinct anatomical locus. It is centered in what he called the cerebro-ocular region. That is, in the cerebral cortex of the brain and in the organ of vision associated with it. Burrow pointed out that it was through the phylogenetic development of the brain's cortex that the perceptual, linguistic, and symbolic operations of the I persona first arose. Therefore, to gain a tangible sense of this objectifying activity, it seems one would need to bring proprioceptive attention to one's cerebral cortex. But this conclusion was informed by more than a simple logical deduction. Burrow claimed to have had a spontaneous experience of the I persona's bodily base. One that profoundly influenced all his subsequent research. After a prolonged period of interpersonal strife involving the members of the group he had established to investigate such I-based conflict. He began to notice a distinctive pattern of tension around his eyes and forehead. Barrow recognized in this the bodily expression of the I persona. We have earlier talked about the reflective consciousness that was developed in pre-antiquity and how this took hold of philosophy, language, Barrow also goes to show the bodily expression. His findings are from 1953, and it would take more than 60 years until neurology would discover the very same tendencies in modern man as he described, the I persona. Take a little break here for boss. Hello and most welcome to the summary. It was a very tough read, and especially the third paragraph on page 261 is extremely pertinent. Therein you have the problem condensed and in a nutshell. Let me give a try to develop it further. If we have the subject in the classical model here, and then we have the beam of light, what lights, and then we have the object. There is a 100% focus on the derived feature, the object. And previously we have spoken about that the object have features that could be ambiguous, tribiguous, and endlessly, infinitely in potentialities. And to put it simply, we have to make do with the derived things, and we do not put any effort to understand the process of thinking, or as Heidegger would have it, the denken, the thinking. And we have forgotten, this is the amnesia of Heidegger, all the way the why. This is the why. Its intention, I would call it consciousness, and in a way we lack full information, because The object is, as we spoke yesterday in Ball about quantum Darwinism, the before is the important thing. The turnout, as my colleague so clearly pointed out in the tennis game, is all we have access to. It is a thing of the past, it is subjective, and we also have seen it's at least ambiguous. Actually, it is infinitely different. It's the superposition. And thereby, we do not know, we don't have that specific access. This is where everything is happening. This is what we should know. And this is what people used to know, as Borrow points out. And we lucidly swept over this in Ian McGilchrist, and he showed, together with Julian Jaynes, that there was a change in language in the pre-Socratic early antiquity around 700 to 600 BC, where the active ingredient, the verbs of the language, became more chopped off, and one part became solidified into a dense, unmoving object. And these objects, I should say, later became the staple of philosophy, the search for the origin, the essence. Among the Ionian philosophers of nature, already a decisive step into reification of the derived and random feature, which is the result of the why, the process. Rosen is using the word lit. It should be lightning, maybe, to put it even clearer, that it is a process going on. It is not fixed like a beam of light from a lamp, as we've spoken before. It is an ongoing, vital, but knowable process. This is where all knowledge is situated. And here we could put in the fractality of Susie Froebel, the thing that reads off. And for those who remember, fractality is the only thing that can read off, the only working thing that in contact with the infinity of the superposed can make an evaluation, an understanding, an experience. This model has in its bosom or bowel representationalism, this pre-antiquity development became later, much later, representationalism. In a way, one could say it's implicit already in the step towards reification of the essence. Because you need to know what is happening on the subject side. And this is then not the case. The subject side is mirroring. We can think of it as a mirror, mirroring the object. And then, of course, we have a representation of the object within the mind. This is the left hemisphere, and this is also the computer model of the mind as observing, eating information of the environment. This process is not acknowledged. Therefore, the object becomes monosemic, and the representation also monosemic, so that there is an absolute correspondence between the inner and outer. Entrat representationalism. In my view, the main dogma of the Tractatus, world and language represent each other in a one-to-one fashion. And Rosen, in a very condensed way, tries to point to a new direction into the verbal instead of the more noun-like and fixed. Oddly enough, the tension around the eyes is today observed. It leads to tension in the forehead. It's almost like my whole posture becomes fixed to see the objects. Where do we have here? What is this? And here is even a sign to warn me that someone could remove the objects, disappear with them, steal them. It's a warning about thievery. And to be honest, I directly noticed it when I entered the room. My eyes were object eyes, looking for things, and it had red color and yellow color, and it was unavoidable. So that's the I persona who seeks the things. It's a bit of a curious, greedy character. Give it to me. I want to perceive it. Maybe there's a comment from my dear colleague here. You want to stand here?
Yes, yes. Hello, hello, hello. Good morning. Let me, can you please check if I'm right here? It appears on the screen. Can you move it around towards the screen here? Let me go back to Rosen's 2017 paper, Quantum Gravity, to make a small comparison. So there, Rosen discussed the word archetype, and he showed, and he went back to etymology to show that this comes from the Greek word typos, that means to beat, to give a blow. Rosen wanted to go away from this Platonic passive understanding of archetype as an image up there that we take in passively. Instead, Rosen wanted to have, as he said, an action. It would be on a primary action pattern. So it's action. Archetype is an action, primary action, and not Platonic changeless ideas. And we could compare this archetype to this Rosen's discussion, this 2021 paper about proprioception. So proprioception, he goes back to Latin capere, which means to take, as he points out. And we can compare it with the other similar verb, carpere, that we have in carpe diem, to seize the day. And the meaning is more or less the same. To take, to seize the day. This is more like the image of picking or plucking like a fruit. But they're more or less the same. You cannot say so take or pick. It's something active. And I think it's important to highlight that proprioception is something active. It's not like passive. Awareness is nothing passive like that, you take in things. But it's really the active taking, like in this archetype, it's a beat blower. Says, I want to highlight the active thing. And Rosen translates proprioception as taking one's, what did he say exactly? Taking one's belonging or something like that. What did he say exactly? Taking proprioception, excuse me. He said that taking one's own, yes, excuse me, taking one's own, proprioception, taking one's own, I think it's good too. Taking one's own is a good, Rosen's translation of proprioception. And I would like even to highlight this active process. So Rosen speaks about the backward movement awareness. I think it's good, but this is perhaps first time I would like to criticize Rosen lightly. It's easy that awareness consciousness becomes this passive, that you take in your surroundings, while I want it more like a flow, like if you put water in the Klein bottle, it's something active, it's not stale water, like backward. But I would like to hear your opinion, Hans. So I would say capturing or really this movement, we need this kind of awareness. Like water you put in the Klein bottle, it's moving. Hans, would you agree with me?
Yeah.
Or is it a backward movement, a proprioception? Or did I misunderstand?
Well, my understanding of it was that there is actually a movement always going on. We cannot avoid it, and this is the movement. And this is why I say the object, the essence, is in a way random. If we don't know the movement that we cause ourselves, my I persona, if it becomes a fixation, can also be seen as a black spot in my perception, that I don't know that it is an activity. It's a forgetfulness of the why, the amnesia. And going to proprioception, I take Rosen to mean as suggestion, to go into one's own understanding, active process. So in a way one could say it cannot become static ever, doesn't matter how much you want, but at the same time this is leading to understanding, and the blow is very good. It's a movement. You say punch.
Yes, I like in punch violence.
Something is happening. It's a doing. I read Jung early at an early age, and to be honest, I perceived the archetypes without reading any of Platonism as being solid, unchanging things out there. And I don't think I'm alone. That misconception became corrected or deepened much later. And this is especially good that Rosen brings it up, that it is a moving thing, something that never stands still. It's constantly. The light is changing, the quality of the light is different, the intensity of the light is different. All these terms are more or less coming from Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty. There is a development. The world is not static. And we gain knowledge here, and we don't lose the knowledge of the static. We are more than able to keep it, and we can live in the world, but we will have greater awareness of what functions cause this thing in ourselves and without. As we know, that's a simultaneous process. World and us together create in an instant, just as in the tennis game that Roger Penrose talked about. It can become static in our minds and we get fixated. Maybe a hint could be, imagine Roger Federer get fixated with that winning game. So next time he play, he wants to redo the same thing. That could lead to failure in the end. The final comment, or okay. I will continue where I left off, and I went into Burrow here. I am in the third paragraph, page 263. Burrow would caution us not to confuse the I persona with the individual ego. We might say that this persona is the species-wide subject that lies behind the appearance of individual subjectivity. But while it is through the I persona that we, as species, create the impression of ourselves as merely isolated, disembodied subjects. The generic I itself is no disembodied subject. It is the bodily process that is central to human functioning as a whole. Therefore, when Borrow became proprioceptively attentive to the I persona rather than continuing to be unwittingly governed by it. And I think this is a repetition of the point. You can become aware of the process that makes the I and the object. So there's no criticism of the I persona, but it is an invitation to become aware of the process of the I. And think of the I in his homonymous way. It's also the I of the beholder. And that I is constantly working. No vision is static. We move our eyes in cyclades, saccades, very quick movement that we are completely unaware of. There are 7 to 8 saccades a second, if I remember correctly. So in the very movement of the eye or the I, there is an ongoing thing that we are unaware of. Therefore, when Borrow became proprioceptively attentive to the I persona, rather than continuing to be unwittingly governed by it. See the difference? He experienced this palpable pattern of tension around the eyes and forehead. Against a background consisting of the tensional pattern of the organism as a whole. He was thus presumably able to apprehend what he called the solidarity of the species. Or the philo-organism. That is, the organism of humanity at large. Barrow's research associate, Hans Sis, in summarizing this attunement to the philo-organismic background, spoke similarly of entering into basic physiological harmony and feeling continuity with the mother organism and with the world. While Burrow was not a philosopher and did not spell out the ontological implications of this collective organicity, Sis implicitly related the philo-organism to the phenomenological work of Erwin Strauss and to the Heideggerian concept of being in the world. I believe we may plausibly link the notion of the philo-organism to the depth-dimensional life world, of which Merleau-Ponty spoke. Where the subject is recognized as but one of the visibles, or we may correlate the generic human organism with a living web within which all relations emerge. That Heidegger called being. And this is the radiant quantum ontological microworld that constitutes the dynamic substrate from which the ontological world of object in space before subject arises. Following his first spontaneous glimmer of the philo-organism, Burrow sought to cultivate the experience in a systematic practice he named contention. He described his procedure as one of setting aside daily experimental periods in which he adhered consistently to relaxing the eyes and to getting the kinesthetic feel of the tension in and about the eyes and the cephalic area generally. Elsewhere, Rosen 1999 proposed a further specification of the tensions in question. Normal binocular vision operates in such a way that our eyes function in concert to bring a particular object into focus. The figure standing out from its background. An example of this is our strong inclination to see either one perspective or the other when viewing the Necker cube. The tendency derives from the well-established neurophysiological habit of binocular convergence. It seems to follow from Burroughs' analysis that binocular convergence is a process of visual objectification that is intimately associated with the symbolic operations of the cerebral cortex. Burrow came close to stating this explicitly when he related the advent of objectifying perceptual activity what he called detention, that is, divided attention, to the elaboration of cortically based linguistic operations and related language to the movement of the musculature in and around the eyes. The ocular facial movements described by Burrow thus can be said to entail the shifting of optical focus from this object to that in continual acts of binocular convergence. And the proprioception of binocular convergence as modeled by the perspectival integration of the Necki cube is what is needed in the observation of the photon. Burroughs' initial efforts were followed by a program of research in which physiological measurements were made of subjects practicing contention while engaged in activities such as reading and viewing pictures. Burrow and his colleagues found changes in respiration, eye movements, and brain wave activity consistent with the idea that participants had become attuned to the phyloorganismic background. In Burroughs' research, however, there was no attempt to observe the phyloorganism directly. Participants proprioceived the eye-brain nexus in the course of observing ordinary objects in a microscopic setting. The ontological quantum realm we are associating with generic organicity thus came into play only as an obliquely perceived background of the everyday ontical world. By contrast, what we have been considering in the present investigation is the prospect of observing the quantum domain in an immediate way via the proprioceptive perception of the photon. Earlier, I noted Bashel's claim that it is possible to train observers to perceive single photons. In this paper, I am suggesting that such micro-perception would necessarily have to be proprioceptive. Here, operating reflexively, the observer would direct his awareness to the eye-brain nexus as his optical muscles seek to fix the photon via binocular convergence. Whereas in ordinary perception, the observer detaches himself from what he observes. With proprioception, the observer's interior process is included. As is required for entering an ontological realm, not amenable to the splitting of the observer and observed. Attempts to observe the photon objectively would only collapse the radiant quantum wave, destroying its coherence. Yesterday we mentioned the habit of the observer involuntarily collapsing without the knowledge of the observer. This automatic process is confused or establishing the world at large. End of my quote. Of course, the full-fledged integration of observer and observed also depends on the unique nature of the photon itself. we have seen that for its part, the photon is not an objective thing that can be investigated as can an ordinary object. Light is not seen, it is the seeing. Or as Sachs put it, light is not a thing on its own. Not an independent object. Instead, it is the inseparable blending of subject and object. Therefore, in observing the photon microproprioceptively, when the observer would bring her attention to the convergent action of her eyes, the photon falling on her retina would not merely register as an objective phenomenon occurring separately from her subjective viewing process. But would connect internally with that process. Seeing the photon in this way the observer would be seeing herself. And not as an object observed by a more abstract self, as in Husserlian introspection. But as one of the visibles. In so observing the photon, she would become the photon. summary and conclusion. The point of departure for this article is recent research into the possibility that human beings can perceive single photons. To better appreciate what quantum perception may entail, I explored several of the principal interpretations of quantum mechanics. I then offered an alternative view based on the ontological phenomenology of Maurice, Merleau-Ponty and Martin Heidegger. The philosophical analysis was next brought into a sharper focus by employing a perceptual model, the Necker cube, augmented by the topology of the Klein bottle.
One hour 58.
Pause there. I will continue with Rosen's summary in the next episode, but until the video ends, I have to add what we previously gone through, and now we have to go many episodes back. I think about 600-700, when we discussed not Barrow and Sis, that was mentioned here, but Bateson, who discovered a method of relieving the tensions in the eye, and his method was later developed further by Peter Grunwald. It is this tendency for a muscular movement in the eyes, the sharpening, that gives object eyes, mentioned by Wittgenstein as the very odd stare of the schizophrenic, where only objects seem to exist, and where the seeing process itself is not understood or part of the knowing. It is a diminished, smaller take on the world, and it's, I would assume, habituated since antiquity. The object eyes was also mentioned by Jung when he met upon a Northern American Indian, who mentioned that the gaze of the Westerners were unsatisfied and sharp, never to be able to rest peacefully on the environment. Instead, constantly possessed by finding the things grasp them with our eyes, therefore putting a strain on the eyes. According to Bateson and Grunewald, this makes for the very prominent feature in the Western world with near-sightedness. In the end, the very eye will be ovalized by constant repetitive pressure. And I think it makes a very nice return to the body. That is a special attitude that makes for the classical world something that which is too close for our vision to observe, but it can be helpful with the Necker cube and the Klein bottle to lead us back to ourselves, to the process that can explain what it is. I think it's very little time. I don't know if you have a shortish comment, Kalle. Maybe next. I think I end here before it ends itself. I have to add only the tension in the neck. A tensed neck is always connected to the sharpenings of the eyes. It is not this flexible process as the neck should be in being able to move about, but it's a small tension in the back of the cape of the neck, almost not sensible